Dear friends and colleagues, thank you all for joining us on this Saturday morning. My name is Melanie Tanilian. I'm the director of the Center for Armenian Studies at the University of Michigan. Before we begin, I would like to thank our program specialist, Naira Tumanian, who, as always, has worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this event happen in the shortest of times. A week ago, civilians in Stepanakert, the capital of the Republic of Artsakh, woke up to air raid sirens and were urged to cover in bomb shelters. It was on the morning of September 27 that serious clashes re-erupted in Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Since then, Armenia has declared martial law and mobilized its military. Azerbaijan has declared a state of war against Armenia. As of today, there have been around 500 confirmed military casualties, but it's also civilians who are struggling and are the victims of this conflict. The Red Cross announced in a statement yesterday that civilians are bearing actually the brunt of the surge of violence. Civilian death and injuries, including children, have been reported on both sides of the line of contact and in Armenia. In addition, hundreds of homes, schools, and hospitals have been destroyed by heavy artillery. World powers and the UN called for peace and immediate de-escalation, but none of that seems to be in sight as of this morning. The dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan is over the region of Nagorno-Karabakh in the South Caucasus, which continues to be internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, but has a majority of population of ethnic Armenians, and now is mostly governed by the Republic of Artsakh, a de facto independent state. The current conflict has its roots in the decision made by Joseph Stalin and his crew in the 1920s that placed the ethnically Armenian region of Nagorno-Karabakh under the control of Azerbaijan. While Armenians living in the region did not welcome the decision, the Soviet rule largely depressed open conflict. But with the beginning of the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the question of Nagorno-Karabakh re-emerged, as Karabakh Armenians demanded that the region was to be transferred from Soviet Azerbaijan to Soviet Armenia. In 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and Armenia and Azerbaijan both gaining independence, the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh succeeded, and which set off a bloody war. During that war, 30,000 people died, or more than that, and more than 1 million people were displaced until a ceasefire agreement was reached in 1994. The ceasefire has been repeatedly violated, and tension have been simmering as low-intensity conflict in the last 3 decades, with significant escalations in April of 2016 and in July of 2020. The current escalation experts argue has all of the signs of a regional spillover capable of pulling bigger players into the conflict. Turkey, Russia, Iran, Syria. Turkey, as many of you know, has pronounced its political and military support of Azerbaijan, including what we read in the news of deploying 1,000 Syrian fighters who are working for a private security firm. It is the task of our panel today to place the current violence in its historical context and analyze the larger regional implications. And for that, we are joined today by Laurence, who I'm sure many of you have heard speak on the BBC as well as on CivilNet. He's also being very active on Twitter. If you're interested in this, follow him on Twitter, and he provides analysis of the ongoing situation every day. He's an associate fellow at the Chatham House and the Caucasus Program Director at a London-based peacebuilding organization called Conciliation Resources. He has more than 20 years of experience as a researcher and conflict resolution expert or practitioner of peacebuilding, as he calls himself. And he is the author of Armenia and Azerbaijan, Anatomy of Rivalry. Secondly, we are joined by Gerard Libaridian, Professor Emeritus of History from the University of Michigan and the former director of the Center of Armenian Studies. Libaridian is both a diplomat and a historian, and most prominently served as the senior advisor to the former president of Armenia, Levon Ter-Petrosyan, and was intimately involved in the ceasefire negotiations between Azerbaijan and Armenia in 1994. He has authored and edited many books and scholarly articles on Armenia, such as the Karabakh file, as well as the English edition of the Sumgait tragedy, pogroms against Armenians in Soviet Azerbaijan. Third, we are joined today by Anna Ohanyan, who is joining us from Stonehill College. She is the Richard B. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations, and has been a Fulbright Fellow twice to the South Caucasus. Her latest book, Russia Abroad, Driving Regional Fracture in Post-Communist Eurasia and Beyond, as well as Networked Regionalism as Conflict Management. Lastly, moderating the panel today will be Ron Suny, so I will disappear from your screen. And Ron Suny is the William Sewell Jr. Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Michigan. He was the first holder of the Alex Manoogian Chair in Modern Armenian History and the founder of the Armenian Studies program here at Michigan. He has authored The Baku Commune, Class and Nationality in the Russian Revolution, Making the Georgian Nation, and his latest book, Stalin, Passage to Revolution, will be available, I think, for your reading pleasures in the next few days, as I saw. So we have an incredible group of experts, and I encourage you to use your question and answer button, which you will be able to find on the bottom center of your screen, to ask questions to our panelists. We, of course, will try to answer all of your questions, but of course we have limited time, so some of them we might not be able to get to. So I would welcome our panelists and thank you so very much for your time and effort at this moment of crisis as the war is ongoing. And I'm looking very much forward to your discussion. And I will turn it over now to Professor Libaridian, who will lead us into this.
Thank you, Melania. Melanie, I'm sorry. I've been wondering about the appropriateness of having a public discussion when this horrible war is going on. Excuse me. But we still need to understand, we still need to think about it. And not only how it started, but where it may lead. This last round of fighting started with a blitzkrieg from Azerbaijan. And it was not expected on the Azerbaijani side that there would be such formidable resistance. Let me then begin with some concerns and questions. We have to understand the significance of the time factor. That is, how does time appear in the thinking of the Azerbaijani and the Armenian sides? For the Azeris, time has run out. It's been too many years since the ceasefire. No agreement has been reached. I'm not saying whose fault. I think there can be issues on both. They say negotiations have led nowhere and there's no other way but war. For the Armenian side, there has been the thinking since 1998 that the Armenian side has time, and it needs to use time in order to become stronger, better, more prosperous, and that has led to the skirmishes of the past and the more serious escalation today. Was this predictable? I think it was, and it was predicted. Was it preventable? I think it was preventable, although it's become more difficult with the passage of time. There is a logic to the escalation, first of diplomacy. I will not go too far back, but I'll go back as far as the new government in Armenia goes. That is, since Nikol Pashinyan became prime minister. And there were high hopes, particularly in Azerbaijan, that that change would produce a change of policy. 2 years ago or so, Nikol Pashinyan and Aliyev met in Dushanbe, and they agreed on the consolidation of the ceasefire, the end of sniping, a telephone line available to both, direct line, etc. So Aliyev agreed to a ceasefire, although he finds that ceasefires consolidate the status quo, which is not in their favor. But he agreed, and this is where we had the highest hopes, and then also these hopes turned into disappointment because each had a different expectation from the consolidation of the ceasefire. Azerbaijan thought that this would be the beginning of, it would create the environment of trust to begin serious negotiations on the substantive issues, the status of Karabakh, the status of the territories around Karabakh under Armenian control, while the Armenian side seemed to think that the consolidation of the ceasefire gives them more time and more quiet time to consolidate democracy, economic development, etc. And the different and opposite expectations led to eventually the disappointment on the part of Azerbaijan that this is not going anywhere. And of course, the escalation of words and the diplomatic words led to the logic of war. And then there's the logic of war itself. The Azeris, it seems to me, at least, are trying to depopulate the area of Karabakh, of Artsakh. That is the striking of civilian targets, cities, towns, villages, infrastructure, aims at feeling Armenians insecure, so they leave, and that resolves the problem for them. For the Armenians, the war seems to be not only one of defense, but to make sure that the Azerbaijanis suffer such a defeat that at least for a long time, they will not think about doing much more. And the Turkish involvement, of course, is important because it has many levels. Turkey has become to totally identify itself with Azerbaijan, not just affinity, kinship support, but total support. And they declared themselves as party to the conflict, which means they will fight alongside Azerbaijan. The next item is the concerns with regard to the post-war. Laurence will speak about the possibilities of the post-war period, however that is achieved. The question I have is whether the sides will step back once somehow ceasefire is reestablished and review their negotiating positions that will make peace possible without another round or more rounds of fighting. The options for a non-war resolution have not been exhausted, in my view, although that's what they think, both sides think, that there's no other way but the war. One final comment about the international aspect of this. The collapse of the Soviet Union did not bring about a new world order, although that was expected. It did leave rivalries in many areas, including the South Caucasus. The absence of no world order was a major problem in terms of resolution of conflicts worldwide, but also we've seen the gradual disappearance of the US from the international scene, which was being useful in some respects. There is no world order, no big brother to tell some of those smaller brothers not to do this or that. And so now we have the situation also of the Minsk group of the OSCE, which has been the main vehicle for negotiations for so long, basically become powerless. It had been ineffective anyway. So right now, the players we have are, internationally speaking, Russia and Turkey. Iran has no chance to get into the negotiations, although it should be consulted. It had been a very good mediator in the past, but right now, the US is not really interested. Europeans are not, except for France. But basically, it seems to me that the big players in the region outside of the fighting are Russia and Turkey. And as I've indicated elsewhere, we may see a repeat of history where whether planned or not, these two powers kind of compel the Armenian side to make concessions that it would not otherwise make. So the main concern I have is now how the war will end and whether there will be some kind of change in attitudes internationally and on the part of the parties to the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. That was excellent. And now we're going to hear from Anna Ohanyan. Unmute yourself, Anna.
Thank you very much for, number one, organizing this panel and creating the space for discourse. And I would, what I would like to add to the conversation, essentially in kind of zooming in, trying to share my perspective as to what is going on at the moment, and then also zooming out, and in terms of trying to map this out on global trends, in terms of global trends. I do want to highlight, and it's a theme that Laurence also will be picking up later, that this particular stage of the conflict, the violence, in terms of its structure, the entry of Turkey, the emergence of paramilitary groups and mercenaries, all of these reflect the changing environment, changing polarity, geopolitical competition in world politics. And they tend to, so essentially Nagorno-Karabakh as a conflict is a litmus test actually for the international community as to how they will manage similar instabilities, which I'm afraid are going to increase moving forward. In terms of trying to understand as to what this conflict is, I thought it'd be useful to share this chart from Uppsala conflict database, which what you see here happening, that the red one, the red and the green are actually the types of conflicts that have been on the increase. There has been a spike with the collapse of the Cold War. These are internationalized conflicts that are on the red one. And the green one is the intrastate conflict. So state-to-state conflicts have been going down, but internal state conflicts, violent civil wars have been on the increase. And a specific subset of that conflict, which Wallenstein, a researcher there, a very important scholar in this context, describes as state formation conflict, meaning these are civil wars over territory. This particular conflicts are particularly difficult to end and to mediate. And these types of conflicts have been increasing actually over the past 10 years or so. Now, zooming out, and I will not go into to detail what, again, the Uppsala conflict database shows that from right before the end of the Cold War, there were 31 state formation conflicts versus 40 civil wars. Since 1989, now we have 65 state formation conflicts versus 60 civil wars. Again, the numbers of state formation, civil wars over territory have increased. Also interesting is that there were 4 state formation conflicts before the Cold War, the 20-year period, that saw a peace agreement only 13%. In the period of 1989 to 2010, that number has increased, meaning that to 31%, meaning 35 agreements. So 89 to 2010 was in a way a golden age, relative golden age, in terms of trying to push for this conflict to have a negotiated outcome. What is happening, unfortunately, now, while these conflicts remain very difficult to solve, the prospects of ending such conflicts with negotiated peace agreements are actually quite dire. So ending this conflict through militarized means, so-called victory consolidation, essentially is the trend that I'm afraid where we are right now. I'm going to stop sharing right now. Just wanted to kind of show you the data. But in terms of this, these types of conflicts take longer. The average lifespan is 23 to 33. This is before 2015 indicators. Relative to other sort of internal civil wars that are not over territory. The average lifespan for those conflicts is 8. So state formation conflicts are hard to negotiate, they see fewer peace agreements, and they're also difficult to win. Importantly, if the military victory consolidation versus negotiated settlement is the path that the leaders take, there are very specific political costs for the conflict parties. And unfortunately, it has been prevalent in the media and the discourse on this to create equation between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and very little analysis as to how their very different domestic political systems shape their behavior in the conflict and shape their incentives for resolution or continuation of war. So a military Azerbaijan's oil-dependent economy and deepening authoritarianism, in my view, remains a significant obstacle for a resolution of the conflict, finding a negotiated settlement in a long-term basis. So the studies also show, Wallenstein's work is very important here in that respect, that a military victory tends to, for the government, let's say, taking Azerbaijan in this case, tends to produce authoritarianism, consolidate authoritarianism for years to come. So any military victory for Azerbaijan will be a political loss for Azerbaijani people. For Armenia, the same, and Nagorno-Karabakh, the risks are somewhat similar in terms of that there's the Armenia's ability in this case in succeeding to pushing back against security or democracy dilemma. That dilemma will be back on the table. Now, also important is the fact that new change in the structure of this conflict is Azerbaijan-Turkey now very openly offensive alliance versus defensive alliance. This creates complicates conflict management because it brings in new players, and Turkey's own democratic decline has also emboldened coercive conflict management pathway. So this only leaves room for top-down approaches and leaves very little room for building institutions of conflict management. In terms of I wanted, since you hear a lot lately on the, not lately, lately in the past few days, the notion of proxy wars, I wanted to share some numbers on that. In terms of while in 1990, there were only 5% of the conflict, civil wars in the world had some sort of jihadist, a rebel group involvement or paramilitary involvement. As of 2014, that number has increased to 40%. So introduction of mercenaries, and I'm not calling them jihadists because I'm not sure yet whether they're there for, my sense is they're there for economic reasons as opposed to ideology. I just don't have enough data on the motive, so I will not comment on it. But the fact that they're there is now not disputed. It has been broadly commented, and that is a very significant change in terms of the structure of the conflict. The involvement of such groups, studies show, extends the duration of the conflict. And while proxy wars were used during the war, their numbers, again, as I pointed out, dropped with the end of the Cold War in that 2 decades of the golden period in conflict management. But the proxy wars also indicate that there are low-cost support by an ally for Turkey in this case. And they can also signal a hesitance on the side of Turkey to commit fully. I'm going to be optimistic and say that there might be easier to pull back as opposed to deploying Turkish forces on the side of Azerbaijan, which we're not seeing. We are also hearing a lot on the regionalization of the conflict. And the regional dimension here is a risk as well as a reward. It can be a reward. In terms of a regional dimension, so this is a spillover, the introduction, exporting players, mercenaries from the Middle East to South Caucasus reflects a regional spillover from the Middle East, but it also it's an importation of a problem that is not there. The rise of jihad, Islamic fundamentalism and mercenaries is a very unique development that grew out of authoritarianism, sectarianism, and religious radicalization in many Middle Eastern countries. State failure in Syria is a very unique problem that is creating this growth. So Turkey's importation of the problem into a region that has already registered significant gains in state building since the end of the Cold War is a really highly irresponsible and very dangerous and very hurtful for Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, importantly. I am worried that this development indicates a neo-feudal, neo-imperial approach to managing regional security, and perhaps we can talk more about this. Now, let me conclude. I'm assuming that I probably don't have much time. I tend to lose track of time when I talk, and I'm not seeing Ron on my screen for some reason. So, a regionalism as a reward. Velvet revolution in Armenia here in this context, I think was the best development for the region that has happened in a long time. And the reason is this: studies show that when democratic pull in a region is strengthening, in this case, with the Velvet Revolution, a democratic dyad was formed between Armenia and Georgia. Studies shows that when democratic pull is strengthening, that increases the cost for warfare in the region, military approaches to conflict, and also increases the cost for authoritarian players to defend their model. So this was a potential that in my writing, I thought could really strengthen, create pressure for Azerbaijan to really move in the right direction of the history, right side of the history. I realize this is a very big, grandiose comment, but we can talk about this as to what this means. At the same time, I am worried. Of course, the Azerbaijan, what Aliyev did, essentially formed his own, deepened its own alliance with authoritarian Erdogan, which essentially worked to offset the democratic dyad between Armenia and Georgia. And let me conclude by simply saying that I am, and I have not done field work on this, but my initial reason, I would have liked to speak to policymakers on the ground in Armenia. I don't think that velvet potential for deeper diplomacy was realized in Armenia. Particularly in regards to Armenia, Georgia, perhaps under the radar, pushing a little bit in creating regional forums of engagement, creating regional structures for the statement to reclaim, to have spaces to talk about these things when hostilities do build up. So I'm going to stop here. I do hope that we can talk about this more tri-dimensional, this 3D approach to understanding what's going on in this particular conflict, that domestic drivers are very significant and under-examined factor as to what's happening in Nagorno-Karabakh right now. And again, I am worried that Nagorno-Karabakh war is the canary in a coal mine and a litmus test for security provision in a multipolar world order moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. And our final panelist is Laurence Burrows. Laurence.
Thank you very much. I hope that you can hear me. Thank you, Melanie and Naira, for organizing this seminar. I wanted to pick up actually where Gerard and Anna left off with the different logics according to which events can now unfold. I agree that the first of these would be the logic of de-escalation and diplomacy. This is what happened in April 2016, but this looks very unlikely as of today. The second logic, as Gerard acknowledged, would be a military one. There are a lot of reports of the successful deployment of drones so far, but that's quite different from effective movement forward or advances on the ground by land forces. And I think we're seeing that in the very intense fighting that's been going on today. There is a third logic, and that is the logic of political deal making. As has already been mentioned, this war, I think, has the potential to eject the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict settlement process out of the framework of crumbling multilateral diplomacy within which it has been embedded since negotiations began in the early 1990s. And there seems to be a possibility that the process could be hijacked by a different logic, a logic of spheres of influence for regional powers in a multipolar world order. It's the third theater after Syria and Libya where Russia and Turkey have inserted themselves into scenarios of extreme civil or regional fracture and are backing different horses. Great powers can be pragmatic and can be partners of sorts as well as rivals. We know that Russia and Turkey have come to blows before and have found ways to manage their relations. As Andrew Kramer of the New York Times puts it, they are frenemies, sometimes rivals, sometimes deal makers. Therefore, the logic of a military outcome could be preempted by the logic of a Russian-Turkish détente on, as the emerging jargon has it, the deconfliction of Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, I've been arguing for years that this is not a proxy conflict, that the drivers of the conflict are local, that they relate to national identity, to the outcomes of the war in the 1990s. But I think there is now a danger of proxification. And in this new dynamic, there are going to be two critical tests of this logic. One will be what happens when patrons say no to their proxies or to their clients. And what happens when clients or proxies say no to their patrons. And I think it's important to acknowledge that Armenia and Azerbaijan are not stricken states or failed states affected by extreme civil conflict like Libya and Syria. And so one can't predict exactly how these dynamics are going to unfold. But one thing is clear, and that is that Russian interests are not synonymous with Armenian interests, and Turkish interests are not synonymous with Azerbaijani interests. But a key implication, if this dynamic of regionalization in a multipolar order is sustained, and if there is a kind of a regionalist capture of conflict management, is that solutions may be found that serve Russian and Turkish interests, and not necessarily those in the South Caucasus. So I guess a key question is whether there is still a chance for diplomacy. There is a lot of speculation as to whether the OSCE Minsk group mechanism can survive. I'd like to recall the Vienna, St. Petersburg, Geneva agenda that was discussed at a series of meetings in those cities in May and summer 2016 that called for real confidence building measures, new infrastructure to support the ceasefire, as well as substantive talks to move forward on the political issues. Another potential vector would be to activate the high-level planning group, which plans for scenarios for peacekeeping forces. Again, though, we, I think, need to see outcomes on the battlefield before that becomes realistic. Another theme here is the potential to include those states that have a more direct stake in regional peace, which are not currently part of the mediation mechanism. Georgia obviously is very deeply affected in every way by what's happening. We've mentioned also Iran, lots of political obstacles there, but Iran has often been a moderating force that doesn't want to see a conflagration to the north. So on that, two points that I'll close with so that we have some time for questions. I think a return to multilateral diplomacy will eventually be inevitable. I have no doubt that top-down conflict management by Russia and Turkey will not be more popular than OSCE mediation, and it will certainly be less able to address the root causes. OSCE mediation, for all its faults, for all its dysfunctionality, is embedded within a system of international order that gives small states a voice and powers of veto. Armenia and Azerbaijan have been able to influence this process in ways that I don't think that they would, or that they would lose in the regionalization of the process. And I'll close by mentioning that I think it's going to be crucial to overcome the mutual alienation between the societies across the conflict divide that has gone on for the last 15 years in particular to a really frightening and deplorable degree. Peace building and contacts across the divide have all but ceased amid a really a very deep alienation when any peace agreement or any movement towards peace necessarily assumes a transformation in relations. And I'll stop there so that we open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurence. Let me sort of sum up what I heard, and maybe this will lead into some of the questions that have come to us. So this is a terrible moment in the history of the Caucasus. A war is now ongoing. People are dying and being killed. It's a war that, in my view, was largely unnecessary and is clearly the result of the failure of compromise, negotiation, and the international community. It's a war, though the fog of war, you know, always leads us to hasty conclusions. The first casualty of war is the truth. But it's clear that for Armenia, the status quo was acceptable. For Azerbaijan, the status quo of occupation of some 20% of Azerbaijan was not acceptable. Azerbaijan decided to change the equation by going to war. It's a war that could result, and maybe is already resulting, in ethnic cleansing. Both sides want the land, but they want a different people on that land. Things have changed, as our wonderful panelists have indicated. It's an expanding conflict. It's involving outside players, important players like Russia and Turkey, clearly not the United States, which has completely erratic foreign policies in any case. The mercenaries have now been involved. And as was indicated, particularly by Anna, it's a particular kind of conflict, civil war, state-making, nation-making, you might say, conflicts which are extraordinarily difficult to try to resolve. I would also add that from everything I've heard and from what we know from history and political science, war is no friend of democracy. And in fact, we are seeing, as I think our panelists certainly indicated, the consolidation and the movement towards greater authoritarianism. So I didn't hear much optimism, but I think the first question that coming out of the questions I heard is, why now? Why, after all these decades of conflict, of armistice, of skirmishes, have we now entered what is essentially a full-fledged war? And I'm going to start with Gerard for that, and then if others have, just indicate to me that you'd like to participate.
Well, why now? Because there is an acceleration of the incidence of armed renewed conflict. If you look at 1994, the ceasefire, the next big round was 2016. The next, which was a number of years, then from 2016 to July 2018 is about 2 years. From July to September is 2 months. That is a reflection of the total exasperation on the part of Azerbaijan, that there could be any negotiations. And the hardening of position in Armenia, justified or not, mutual mistrust and mutually exclusive statements. And the second is the international situation where the international order does not exist, where even NATO is powerless. International organizations are powerless. The US is absent. And the third factor is, and there's the pandemic. And the third factor is Turkey's, the logic of Turkey's involvement or gradually that strengthened Azerbaijan's belief that this time they could win.
Okay, Laurence, Laurence, I see your hand, so go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with many of the points that Gerard made. I think global distraction, US elections doing this perhaps while President Trump is still in power, all important factors. I think we should also acknowledge the perhaps naive expectations of a reset after the Velvet Revolution. I mean, a number of moves and symbolic steps have been made that were deeply aggravating for the Azerbaijani side. There are consistent references to kind of more populist speech making on the part of the Armenian Prime Minister, but also the announcement of the third road crossing the occupied territories between Kapan and Hadrut, the symbolic politics of Shusha, the city that was an Azerbaijani majority city prior to the conflict. The holding of the inauguration of de facto President Arayik Harutyunyan was received very badly, and shortly before the outbreak of violence, the announcement that the de facto parliament would move to Shusha, I think these moves were received as evidence of an annexation policy and the hopelessness of the peace process. I would add the kind of the global pandemic factor. We are all in for hard times ahead in a global recession, and perhaps there was a sense that, you know, it's now or never, and some military achievement could perhaps insulate the government in Azerbaijan in the face of forthcoming protests in the coming months and years. So yeah, I would add those factors.
Let me intervene here, and I have special questions for Anna, and that is looking ahead. There were some requests that you clarify what you mean by the institutions of conflict resolution. That is, what possibilities are there given the situation at the moment and the assemblage of causes that were mentioned by the previous two speakers? Are there possibilities? Are there openings? How would you, what would you suggest?
I'm very thankful for that question, because I have a tendency to be verbose and fast, and
I'll try to deal with that. Yeah, go ahead.
But the institutions are of huge importance, and I'm going to break a cardinal rule that I have and not analyze and offer policy implications of our research which is not reviewed yet. I just finished a book manuscript that is under review, largely looking at the comparative historical period of Turkey, Ottoman, Russian, and the Habsburg empires in the areas where currently we have conflicts. I did a big dive in Ron, in your work, actually. I've been reading you for the past year. What is interesting and important that we miss, and it might seem too distant and irrelevant, that there but at the same time, I feel like there's deja vu moment for me right now, watching as to what's going on. With Turkey's involvement enabling Azerbaijan, the key component is the institutional obliteration that at various levels that exist between conflict parties. So looking at what I mean by conflict management institutions, this is pretty broad. As Laurence pointed out, currently in the context of this period, this state formation, territorialized conflict separate the conflict parties. So there's not a lot of interaction. All the track 2 projects, confidence building measures have been ad hoc and inconsistent. And unfortunately, again, the Western energy needs, the oil politics emboldened Azerbaijan over the years, making it very difficult to create such contacts. Every peacebuilding practitioner will tell you that since current Aliyev came to power, all of those peacebuilding contacts became difficult. Whenever I want to reach out with any Azerbaijani with whom I met, behind closed doors, scholars, etc., I always step back and wonder whether I'm jeopardizing, whether their accounts are being monitored. So that's a huge loss. It is not, I don't think it's justifiable to say that we did, and I don't think Aliyev has been honest when saying the diplomatic process has not worked, so therefore I'm justified to use violence, because Aliyev has worked quite aggressively in undermining the institutions of conflict management. Now, if you compare this to 1918 period, very often analysts will dismiss that the Transcaucasian Federative Republic was short-lived, but it did not come out of thin air. There was very deep engagement between community elites for decades. Hudi Berberian's work, Rolling Revolutionaries, shows, building on other scholarship also in that period, shows the hybridity of this region. There were communal clashes. There was the genocide in the Ottoman Empire that is absolutely true. And despite that violence, there was also very deep engagement, a consistent engagement between the community leaders. So I think the institutions are of huge importance, and Azerbaijan needs to be held to account for destroying the institutions of engagement on the one hand, and then complaining the conflict management, the mediation process does not work.
Thank you, Anna. So there's been, the questions are extraordinary, and we should be discussing this for many years, in fact, but we can't do that. But I'm going to try to cluster some questions together. And what I'd like our speakers, I'm going to give each of you a chance, because we don't have very much time. There have been a lot of questions about Turkey. That is, why is Turkey doing this today? What does Erdogan have to gain from this? What will be the effect on the Armenian community within Turkey of this accelerated and escalating conflict? That's one set of questions that I'd like you guys to comment on. I'll give each of you a turn. And the second has been about Russia. Russia seems to be standing back so far, and yet there are kind of conspiratorial theories within Russia at the moment that Russia is using this conflict to sort of punish Armenia for not sort of falling into line with its own Russian ambitions. It seems a little bit far-fetched, but in our day and age, such speculative, conspiratorial, bizarre ideas seem to have a huge role. Let me start with Laurence this time, then Gerard, and then Anna. And really, these might have to be your final statements, so try to be succinct and let us conclude in some sensible way. I'll give you each at least 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. If that's okay, I'll take the Russia question. So there are two schools of thought out there that I've seen. One is that there is a grand strategy in the Kremlin, and that perhaps Russia and Turkey are not on opposite sides in this conflict. Russia is hanging back. It's giving some space to Azerbaijan and Turkey to potentially take back some territories, to discipline Armenia in the aftermath of the Velvet Revolution, and perhaps to swoop in after a genuine crisis with preconditions. Perhaps one of those conditions would be the deployment of Russian boots on the ground in the form of peacekeepers. This is the only conflict that emerged in the 1990s where Russia wasn't successful in inserting peacekeeping forces that subsequently became very important levers in the conflicts as they unfolded in the coming decades. So there's a lot of speculation, much of it conspirological, around the so-called Lavrov plan, that this was essentially aiming to get Russian boots on the ground. And so this could be a pretext for securing that outcome, thereby ensuring Russia's long-term presence, ensuring Armenia's loyalty, and preserving the leverage power that this conflict gives to Russia in the South Caucasus. The other school of thought is that Putin's been taken by surprise, distracted with Belarus, and really not able to come up with a meaningful initiative. I think it's very instructive in a sense that in April 2016, by day 4, Moscow had convened the military chiefs, Khachaturov and Sadigov, in Moscow, and had already brokered a ceasefire. Now, as I've explored in one of my threads on Twitter, I think the truth is that we're actually looking at a kind of a policy void that follows the breakdown of a policy. Russia's policy in this conflict has been what I call pivotal deterrence, drawing on the work of Timothy Crawford. A pivotal deterrence scenario is where a pivot moves between two states and prevents them from going to war. Key to pivotal deterrence is generating uncertainty. Russia has generated that uncertainty through a mix of different, often incoherent, contradictory policies, whether those are security alliance with Armenia, offering security guarantees to one of the parties, arming both of them, at the same time pursuing mediation initiatives, and always using quite ambiguous strategic language so that everybody's guessing as to what Russia might do in the event of a full-scale war. Now, that policy to date has worked more or less. It has generated uncertainty in Azerbaijan, making it cautious about large-scale military engagements. And it has extracted from Armenia a number of crucial concessions. So there's a kind of ingratiation dynamic between Yerevan and Moscow, forcing concessions such as, for example, rejection of the association agreement with the European Union and accession into the Eurasian Union. Now, the key thing about this strategy or policy of pivotal deterrence is that it works for as long as its targets don't have alternative alignment options. Azerbaijan is a small state, and a nightmare scenario is that it ends up in a protracted conflict, but isolated internationally. And Turkey's entry has changed this. We've discussed this to some degree already. There has been vigorous diplomatic support, but I think particularly since July, since the escalation in the area of the Armenia-Azerbaijan border, that has converted into much more concrete promises of support. Support that may take forms short of actual war or boots on the ground, but certainly, you know, I think we can reliably say that Turkish drones are in action. And so, you know, this is a huge setback, and I'll finish quickly. And so I think Russia is scrabbling around to devise a viable policy that would both preserve its influence over the parties, over the situation, but also preserve its role in a multilateral structure such as the Minsk Group. Because without that, Russia would just start to look like a geopolitical actor, a former imperial power throwing its weight around in its backyard. And Russia has enjoyed, I think, and benefited from the symbolism of being a good cooperative multilateralist in the Minsk Group. So I think it's actually a kind of a policy void and scrabbling around to find a viable response.
Thank you, Laurence. Gerard, some of these big questions of outside players and maybe even civil society actors within these countries.
Well, let me begin by making a very simple but very important observation with regard to the international community. We have to understand and accept that the international community, as far as the resolution of this conflict is concerned, is with Azerbaijan. There's no question about it. Is there anyone, including Russia, France, Greece, Cyprus, friends of Armenia, that says Karabakh should be independent? None. Is there any country in the world that says the Armenian side could keep the territories under its control? None. Consequently, there is no disagreement between Turkey, Russia, US, France as to how the resolution should work out. There isn't. That is very important in terms of determining the level and kind of cooperation between Turkey and Russia. Russia may be, I doubt that it was surprised by what happened. It is impossible to see the accumulation of firepower in Azerbaijan without seeing what is happening. Russia knows these countries much better than other countries. Putin and Erdogan had a discussion 2 weeks before. What did Erdogan tell Putin about its involvement in the conflict? It is not possible for me to imagine that they were surprised. Now, there may be details about which they're not sure, but the overall policy of Russia is very clear with regard to the South Caucasus, and Laurence described it very well. I'm one of those that Laurence described as to how things are evolving. Overall, I don't see any indication that explanation of a Turkish-Russian kind of cooperation, whether conscious or not, to press Armenia. Russia is not happy at all with democracy and the government selling democracy. By the way, I should say with regard to Russia, to Georgia, that although both are democratic, what defines Georgian-Armenian relations is not their domestic policy. It is that Georgia has a secessionist problem on the other side of the secessionist problem Armenia has. That is, Armenia is supporting secessionism in another state, and Russia is secessionist, supporting secessionists in Georgia. This is the fundamental thing, but overall also, Georgians resent Armenia 100% for remaining friends and allies of Russia even after the democratic revolution in Armenia, while they are very pro-Western. In terms of Erdogan's policies, I think to what I could add to what I said earlier is that Erdogan has this megalomaniac idea that he's sultan and caliph, or would like to be. So he's inserting himself in, other than Syria and Iraq, in Lebanon, in Libya, now in Azerbaijan, and the South Caucasus, to prove that he's the defender of the faith and he's defender of some kind of order. Let me add 2 points, since this would be my last this point. That is, the insertion of hired fighters is not new in the conflict. In the 1993-94 war, we had mujahids from Afghanistan that were brought in, and there was a plan to bring 1,500 new ones, 1,500, in a contract signed in Iran with the help of Iran between Afghanistan and Azerbaijan, to bring 1,500 of them for the next round of fighting. And Armenia took steps that stopped that, which kind of discouraged Azerbaijan from thinking of another round, and that's how the ceasefire was signed. One final comment. It doesn't seem to me right now that Turkey or Azerbaijan are willing to to stop the fighting or to move toward consolidation until they may succeed or not, until they have achieved some kind of defeat for the Armenian side and extracted some kind of concession before they sit at the table, before they stop the fighting, if they are not defeated. But they will not stop, in my view.
Okay, for our final word, I'm going to turn to Anna Ohanyan. And then at this moment, I'll turn it over to Melanie, who will have the difficult, if not impossible, task of ending this fantastic discussion. Anna. Sure.
Well, I think in very quickly on Russia, I do think that Russia is perhaps, if it is and I'm speculating, if it is a collapse of its policy on the side of Russia, we should also think that it is an opening for Georgia and Armenia, and ideally Azerbaijan, it is a space that they can reclaim some sort of regional institutional domain in taking ownership of their region. Right now, South Caucasus is repeating the same pattern of being caught in a regional fracture from which it has never recovered. I mentioned the pre-Soviet period where there was an opening and these institutions were being developed in that direction, but Georgia and then the Soviet powers put an end to that. So that's a little bit quickly on Russia, as to it might be sitting back also to achieve hurting stalemate on all sides, which makes it more likely for any deal that Russia offers that the sides will take. So that's pure speculation on my side. However, I do think that both Russia and Turkey are neo-imperial powers, but they practice that power quite differently. Russia is not using Russian nationalism as a foreign policy strategy, foreign policy signature, and it allows Russia to kind of remain broad and a lot more inclusive, in quotation marks in some respects. And one of the reasons as to why it's also, it's not playing regional card, and it's eager obviously to reclaim Azerbaijan. Turkey, on the other hand, is a much more short-sighted as a neo-imperial power, because with Erdogan, with democratic declines inside Turkey, Turkish foreign policy became increasingly Islamist. This is really driven from Turkish domestic politics. So there's reduced Turkish foreign policy in some respects, but very similar to Russia, Turkey is also practicing this regional fracture in the Middle East and in the South Caucasus. And the way, what it does for these players, these hegemonic neo-imperial players, is it allows them to project global power in this relatively low cost for them victories on the ground. But this is this fracturing, regional fracturing can be a short-term lever for these players, but a liability if these players, Russia or Turkey, want to be a global powers or bigger regional powers, especially as we're moving multipolar world order. So yeah, I do think that, and in a desperate hope of ending on a positive note, that Georgia dimension is really critical. Georgia expressed an interest to mediate, to offer space to engage. That does not mean that Georgia will lead the role. It is only space for countries, instead of looking at Moscow or to Europe or to United States, start meeting regionally. That would signal that they're taking ownership of the region. If they don't do it now or never, this window will be closing very soon.
Thank you, Anna. Now I'm going to turn it over to Melanie and thank all the panelists for this wonderful discussion. It will go on.
Thank you so very, very much. I really appreciate you all taking the time, and especially doing it on such short notice. We've really just did this within a few days, and to generously participate in this discussion. And I think it was very lively and very informative, of course, for many of us. There were many more questions that we didn't get to, and as Ron said, we could talk about this, of course, for many more hours. But I want to be respectful of your time, and I just want to reiterate what Ron is saying. Thank you so very much for your participation and also for all the attendance on the other side. Thank you so much.